The X-Men helped define the modern superhero movie. But somewhere along the way, one of cinema's most important franchises faded into irrelevance. The series became increasingly fragmented and directionless. So, how did one of Hollywood's biggest comic book franchises go extinct? In the year 2000, a movie arrived that would quietly change Hollywood for the next quarter century. Not Spider-Man, not Iron Man, not the Avengers, X-Men. Today, looking back at it through the lens of billion-dollar cinematic universes and world-ending CGI spectacles, the original X-Men feels surprisingly modest. The costumes were restrained. The scale was relatively small. There were no portals opening in the sky or armies of faceless monsters. But what the film lacked in spectacle, it made up for in heart. The movie wasn't a direct adaptation of any specific comic storyline. Instead, it captured something far more important: the spirit of the X-Men. At its core, the story was about isolated people searching for a place to belong, outsiders trying to survive in a world that feared them. And perhaps most importantly, the film transformed Hugh Jackman from a relatively unknown actor into one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Even now, when many people think of Wolverine, they don't picture the comic book version. They picture Hugh Jackman. The film's greatest strength was that it understood its characters. Magneto wasn't simply trying to destroy the world because he was evil. His motivations came from trauma. A Holocaust survivor who had witnessed humanity at its worst. He genuinely believed mutants needed to take control before humanity repeated its mistakes. His plan to forcibly mutate world leaders wasn't the scheme of a cartoon villain. It was an exploration of what happens when someone becomes so desperate for progress that they are willing to force it upon others. The movie asked difficult questions, and audiences responded. 3 years later, X2, X-Men United arrived, and somehow it was even better. Rather than simply repeating the formula of the first film, X2 expanded the world and deepened its themes. We learn more about Wolverine's mysterious past. The conflict becomes larger. And this time, instead of good mutants fighting bad mutants, humanity itself becomes the antagonist. The film offers a surprisingly nuanced perspective on discrimination. The mutants feel rejected, the humans feel threatened. Neither side exists in a vacuum. Fear creates prejudice. Prejudice creates fear. And caught in the middle is Charles Xavier. His idealism anchors the story. Xavier represents the belief that doing the right thing matters even when the people around you hate or fear you. The film's villain, William Stryker, is one of the franchise's strongest antagonists. A military colonel connected to Wolverine's past, Stryker sees mutants as an existential threat. His plan is simple: capture Charles Xavier and use Cerebro to exterminate every mutant on Earth. It's a chilling premise, because unlike Magneto, Stryker isn't trying to change humanity. He's trying to erase part of it. The movie ends on a bittersweet note. The heroes win, but the victory comes at a terrible cost. Jean Grey sacrifices herself to save her friends. And as the camera lingers on the waters of Alkali Lake, audiences knew exactly what was coming next: the Phoenix Saga, or at least that's what they thought. Because behind the scenes, things were about to change dramatically. Bryan Singer and much of his creative team left the franchise to make Superman Returns, following Brett Ratner leaving the project. In one of Hollywood's stranger twists of fate, Brett Ratner would end up directing X-Men: The Last Stand. The result isn't necessarily a terrible film, but it is a very different one. Where the first two films focused on characters and themes, The Last Stand prioritizes action and spectacle. The central conflict revolves around a newly discovered cure for mutation. For the first time, mutants are presented with a choice: remain mutants or become human. The premise creates fascinating moral questions. Is mutation a gift? Is it a disability? Or can it be both? Some mutants view the cure as genocide, others view it as freedom. Rogue, for example, chooses to give up her powers so she can finally live a normal life. Meanwhile, Magneto rallies the Brotherhood to destroy the cure before it can spread. And in the background, Jean Grey returns from the dead. Only now she is something far more dangerous: the Phoenix. The film attempts to tackle multiple storylines simultaneously: the cure, Phoenix, Magneto's war, human-mutant relations, and as a result, none of them receive the depth they probably deserved. The themes become muddled, and the messaging becomes less clear. And yet, despite its flaws, The Last Stand marked the end of an era, at least temporarily. It's difficult for modern audiences to understand just how different Hollywood was back then. Today, every successful movie is expected to become a franchise. But in the early 2000s, trilogies were considered the gold standard. 3 movies: beginning, middle, end. Anything beyond that often carried the stigma of diminishing returns. Outside of horror franchises and Star Trek, few series continued indefinitely. But Fox saw something else. They saw opportunity. The X-Men universe was enormous. There were dozens of memorable characters, decades of stories people had come to rave over, and billions of dollars potentially waiting to be made. So Fox devised a plan. Expand the franchise through spin-offs and prequels. Build an interconnected universe. This was years before Marvel Studios would perfect the formula. And naturally, they began with the franchise's most popular character, X-Men Origins. Wolverine initially generated genuine excitement. Audiences loved Hugh Jackman's portrayal. The trailers looked promising. We saw Logan fighting in multiple wars throughout history. For a brief moment, it looked like the film might explore what it means to live for centuries. Many fans expected something closer to Highlander, a sweeping historical epic, a story moving back and forth through different historical eras. Instead, what they received felt like one of the biggest Hollywood cash grabs of its generation. The film spends enormous amounts of time rewriting established continuity. Characters appear because audiences recognize them, not because the story needs them. The narrative becomes little more than a chain of action sequences connected by increasingly questionable decisions. Rather than providing meaningful insight into Logan's life, the movie rushes from one set piece to another. Everything feels superficial. Everything feels manufactured. And worst of all, it directly contradicts the films that are supposed to take place after it. This is where continuity breaks. And this is arguably the moment the X-Men cinematic universe truly failed. Because once audiences stop believing the universe matters, the universe stops mattering. Fox attempted to recover with X-Men First Class, and remarkably, they succeeded. First Class takes audiences back to the 1960s, a world of Cold War paranoia, spy thrillers, and historical intrigue. We see the origins of Charles Xavier and Eric Lensher. We watch their friendship form, and eventually collapse. The film explores how 2 men can share the same dream while fundamentally disagreeing on how to achieve it. Charles believes in coexistence. Eric believes in self-preservation. The tragedy is that both understand the world better than the other. The movie also served another purpose. It introduced a younger generation of actors capable of replacing the original cast, to give the franchise a new starting point. For a moment, the future looked bright. Then came the Wolverine. And perhaps for the first time in years, the franchise felt focused again. Director James Mangold stripped away much of the franchise's excess. The story follows Logan after the events of The Last Stand. Charles is gone, Scott is gone, Jean is gone, and Logan is drowning in grief. When a dying man from Logan's past offers him the chance to become mortal, Logan is forced to confront a question he has avoided for decades. What happens when the man who cannot die is finally given the opportunity? The film isn't perfect, but it understands something many of the other entries forgot. Character comes first, action comes second, and its ending left fans genuinely excited. Charles Xavier and Magneto have returned, and together they warn Logan of a coming threat. That threat would arrive in the form of X-Men Days of Future Past, a loose adaptation of one of the most beloved X-Men stories ever written. The opening sequence remains one of the strongest in the franchise. The future is dying. Sentinels have exterminated mutants and humans alike. Civilization has collapsed. The survivors have one final chance. Send Wolverine into the past, change history, save the future. The film successfully combines both generations of X-Men actors while revisiting the franchise's familiar themes: fear, war, extremism, diplomacy, hope. By the end, history has changed. The timeline has been rewritten, and Logan awakens in a future where everyone is alive. Jean, Scott, Charles. For many viewers, this felt like the perfect ending. The timeline repaired, the cast restored. A satisfying conclusion, but then came the post-credits scene with one of the X-Men's greatest villains. Finally, it seemed as though Fox was going to build toward a major antagonist in the same way Marvel was building toward Thanos, or so people thought. Instead, audiences received X-Men Apocalypse, one of the most disappointing entries in the entire franchise. Days of Future Past repaired the timeline only for Apocalypse to immediately abandon the restored future and return to the younger cast. Once again, we watch Wolverine escape the Weapon X program. For the third time, once again, cameos replace storytelling. Once again, spectacle replaces substance. Producer John Ottman later claimed the film entered production without a finished third act. Apparently, there was only a beat sheet, which raises a rather uncomfortable question. How does a blockbuster of this size move forward without a completed script? The answer probably explains the final product. Apocalypse himself feels underdeveloped. The stakes feel artificial, and the film ultimately exists to set up Jean Grey becoming the Phoenix again. Fortunately, the franchise still had one masterpiece left. Because while the cinematic universe was falling apart around him, Hugh Jackman was about to deliver the performance of his career, Logan. By the time Logan arrived in 2017, something interesting had happened. Audiences had largely stopped caring about the larger X-Men universe. The timelines were confusing. The continuity was inconsistent. Characters died and returned so frequently that consequences often felt temporary. The franchise had spent years trying to become a cinematic universe, and in many ways, it had lost sight of what made people care in the first place: the characters. Logan strips all of that away. No world-ending threat, no giant crossover event, no setup for future movies, no elaborate universe building. Just an old man nearing the end of a very long road. From the opening scene, the film feels different. This isn't a superhero blockbuster. It's a western, a road movie, a character drama, a story about aging, regret, and mortality. The world is tired. Charles is tired. Logan is tired. Even the audience is tired. And the film understands that. For nearly 2 decades, Hugh Jackman had played Wolverine as an action hero, the unstoppable survivor, the fighter who always got back up. Logan asks a much more uncomfortable question. What happens when the man who always gets back up no longer can? For the first time, Wolverine feels vulnerable. Not because an enemy has found a way to defeat him, but because time finally has. His body is failing. His healing factor is weakening. The pain he spent a lifetime ignoring is finally catching up with him. And perhaps most importantly, he's forced to confront the consequences of his own failures. This isn't the confident hero of the early films. This is a man carrying decades of guilt. A man wondering whether any of it mattered, whether any of the fighting accomplished anything at all. James Mangold wisely avoids turning these questions into melodrama. Instead, he treats them with remarkable restraint. The action is brutal when it happens, but the violence has weight. Every injury matters. Every death matters. Every decision matters. For perhaps the first time in the franchise, consequences feel real. The relationship between Logan, Charles, and Laura becomes the emotional core of the story. 3 generations: the past, the present, the future. Charles represents a dream that is fading. Logan represents a generation that has spent its life fighting. Laura represents the future neither of them will fully live to see. And ultimately, that's what Logan is about. Legacy. Not the legacy we leave for ourselves, but the legacy we leave for others. The hope that the next generation might succeed where we failed. The hope that they might build something better. The film isn't interested in saving the world. It's interested in saving a future. And because of that, the emotional impact lands far harder than most superhero films ever achieve. When Logan finally dies, it doesn't feel like a shocking twist. It feels inevitable, a natural conclusion to a journey that began 17 years earlier. More importantly, it feels earned. This wasn't a death designed to set up another sequel. It wasn't a cliffhanger. It was an ending, a genuine ending, something the franchise had struggled to provide for years. For Hugh Jackman, it seemed like the perfect farewell. For James Mangold, it was proof that comic book movies could be more than spectacle. And for audiences, it was a reminder of what the X-Men franchise was capable of when it prioritized storytelling over franchise management. Ironically, the best X-Men film in years succeeded by doing the exact opposite of what a cinematic universe is supposed to do. It stood on its own. And perhaps that's the greatest criticism of the franchise as a whole. Whenever the X-Men focused on building a universe, the results were often disappointing. Whenever they focused on telling a compelling story, the results were often excellent. Logan should have been the final chapter, the last great farewell, the closing note on a franchise that had changed Hollywood forever. But Hollywood never leaves money on the table, however little it may be. And the story wasn't quite over yet. Because even after Logan, the X-Men franchise still had one more chapter left to stumble through. Dark Phoenix, a film that, in many ways, already felt like an echo before it even released. The story had been attempted once before in The Last Stand, with mixed results at best. This time, Fox tried again with the first-class cast, hoping for better results. But by this point, something had clearly shifted behind the scenes. The X-Men films no longer felt like they were building toward anything. They felt like they were closing accounts. And then, during production, the situation changed entirely. Disney acquired Fox. Suddenly, the long-term future of the franchise was no longer in Fox's hands. The X-Men, once envisioned as the foundation of an expansive cinematic universe, were now being folded into the ever-growing Marvel machine. Plans were scrapped. Projects were canceled, including titles like the Gambit solo film that had been stuck in development limbo for years. And Dark Phoenix, released into that uncertainty, feels like a film that simply exists because it had already gone too far to stop. The result is subdued in a way that is hard to ignore. A story about cosmic power and transformation that never quite achieves liftoff. Jean Grey becomes the Phoenix again. The stakes rise again. The world is threatened again. But none of it carries the weight it should. Not because the ideas are inherently bad, but because the franchise around them no longer feels stable enough to support them. It's difficult to invest in a climax when the audience already knows there may not be anything after it. And in that sense, Dark Phoenix isn't really a finale. It's a transition, a quiet handoff, from one era of superhero filmmaking to another. And then, for a time, the X-Men disappeared, not from memory, but from active development, until Deadpool and Wolverine arrived, a film that does something interesting with the franchise's legacy. Instead of trying to fix continuity, it laughs at it. Instead of trying to build a universe, it acknowledges that the universe never fully held together in the first place. And yet, there's affection beneath the jokes, especially with the return of Hugh Jackman, not as a triumphant savior of continuity, but as a variant searching for meaning in the wreckage of multiple timelines. It's a strange kind of closure, not a clean ending, but an acknowledgement that the attempt itself mattered. Now the X-Men sit in an unusual position, no longer the center of a competing cinematic universe, but not gone either. Now, we wait for Avengers Doomsday, for Secret Wars, for whatever comes next in the ever-expanding Marvel framework. And that brings the story back to where it began. In the year 2000, X-Men didn't just succeed as a film. It changed what superhero movies could be. It helped open the door for the entire era of comic book cinema that followed. Without it, the modern blockbuster landscape likely looks very different. But as a cinematic universe, it never quite reached its potential. The ingredients were always there: iconic characters, decades of stories, a massive built-in audience. What it lacked was consistency, a unified vision that could carry it from film to film without constantly resetting its own foundations. Instead, the franchise became a series of peaks and valleys, some of the best superhero films ever made, and some of the most baffling. But taken as a whole, its legacy is still undeniable, because even failed experiments can reshape the industry. Even incomplete universes can change expectations. And in its own awkward way, the X-Men franchise did exactly that. It showed Hollywood what was possible, even if it never quite figured out how to sustain it. As Charles Xavier once said, this process is slow, but every few hundred millennia, evolution leaps forward. The X-Men cinematic universe may have never fully taken flight, but the idea behind it did, and the industry has been chasing it ever since.